The sun burned hot over the dusty hills of Palestine in the year 1187. In this ancient land where three great religions were born, the sound of clashing swords echoed across the valleys. Christian knights in heavy armor faced Muslim warriors on swift horses. The fate of the holy city of Jerusalem hung in the balance. Two men would soon become the greatest enemies and yet the most respected rivals in all of medieval history. One was a Kurdish warrior who had risen from humble beginnings to unite the entire Muslim world. The other was an English king whose fiery temper and skill with a sword had earned him a legendary nickname. Their names were Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. This is the story of the Third Crusade, a holy war that lasted from 1189 to 1192. It was a time when Christians from Europe traveled thousands of miles to fight for control of Jerusalem and the other holy places. Against them stood the armies of Islam, united for the first time in decades under one brilliant leader. But this tale is much more than just another war story. It is about honor between enemies. It is about respect that grew between two men who understood each other even as they tried to destroy each other. It is about how even in the darkest times of conflict, human dignity can shine through. The medieval world of the late 1100s was a place of great change and terrible violence. In Europe, powerful kings ruled over kingdoms that were always at war with each other. Knights followed a code called chivalry that taught them to be brave, loyal, and honorable. The Catholic Church was the most powerful force in European life, and when the Pope called for a holy war, thousands of men answered. In the East, the Islamic world had been divided for many years. Different Muslim rulers fought each other for power while the Christian Crusader states grew stronger along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. These Crusader kingdoms had been established nearly 100 years. Earlier, when the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, the man who would change everything was born around 1137 in a small fortress town called Tikrit. His real name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but history would remember him as Salah ad-Din, which means righteousness of the faith. Europeans could not pronounce his Arabic name easily, so they called him Saladin. Saladin was Kurdish, part of a proud mountain people who had served as soldiers and administrators throughout the Islamic world. His family worked for the Zengid dynasty, Muslim rulers who controlled parts of Syria and Iraq. From his earliest years, Saladin learned that the Muslim world was weak because it was divided. Sunni and Shia Muslims fought each other. Different rulers cared more about their own power than about driving out the Christian invaders. As a young man, Saladin watched and learned. He saw that the Crusader states survived not because they were strong, but because the Muslims around them were always fighting each other instead of working together. He began to dream of a day when all Muslims would unite under one leader. He began to believe that he could be that leader. Far to the west, in the rich lands of France and England, another future legend was growing up. Richard Plantagenet was born on September 8, 1157, into one of the most powerful families in Europe. His father was Henry II, King of England and ruler of lands stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, perhaps the most remarkable woman of her age. Eleanor had been Queen of France before she became Queen of England. She had traveled to the Holy Land on the Second Crusade. She was a patron of poets and musicians who created the romantic stories of knights and courtly love. From her, Richard learned that war could be glorious and that a true knight must always seek honor and fame. Richard grew up in the sophisticated courts of southern France, where troubadours sang songs of brave knights and beautiful ladies. But he also learned the harsh realities of medieval politics. His family was constantly at war, sometimes with outside enemies, sometimes with each other. Richard himself rebelled against his father more than once. He learned early that even family bonds meant little when power was at stake. By the time Richard became King of England in 1189, he had already earned his nickname Coeur de Lion or Lionheart for his courage in battle. Unlike many medieval kings who preferred to stay safe in their castles, Richard loved to fight on the front lines. He was tall and strong, with reddish-gold hair and piercing blue eyes. Poets said he looked like a lion when he charged into battle. Richard cared little for the day-to-daysness of ruling England. His heart belonged to war and adventure. He spoke French better than English and spent very little time in England during his 10-year reign. Some historians say he viewed England mainly as a source of money to pay for his military campaigns. When news reached Europe in late 1187 that Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin, Richard's response was immediate and dramatic. He took the cross, making a sacred vow to join the crusade to recapture the Holy City. This was not just about religion for Richard. This was his chance to win the greatest prize in medieval warfare and establish himself as the greatest knight in all of Christendom. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem had shocked the Christian world. The Holy City had been in Christian hands for 88 years. Now it was Muslim again. Even worse for the Crusaders. Saladin had accomplished this without the terrible massacre that had marked the Christian conquest of the city in 1099. When Saladin's army entered Jerusalem, they allowed Christians to leave safely if they could pay a ransom. Those who could not pay were sold into slavery, but no one was killed just for being Christian. This merciful treatment of defeated enemies was typical of Saladin's character. He was a devout Muslim who truly believed he was fighting a holy war, but he also believed that God wanted him to show mercy to his enemies. This combination of military skill and personal honor would make him respected even by his Christian opponents. The stage was now set for one of history's greatest confrontations. In the east, Saladin controlled a unified Muslim empire stretching from Egypt to Iraq. His armies were experienced, well-equipped, and totally devoted to their leader. In the west, Richard was gathering the largest and best-equipped Crusader army ever assembled. French, English, German, and Italian knights were preparing to travel thousands of miles to fight for the Holy Land. These two remarkable men had never met, but they would soon test each other in ways that would reveal the very best and worst of medieval warfare. Their conflict would become legendary not just for its military brilliance, but for the mutual respect that grew between two enemies who recognized greatness in each other. The Third Crusade was about to begin, and with it one of history's most fascinating stories of honor, courage, and the complex relationship between worthy adversaries. The fortress town of Tikrit stood like a stone guardian on the banks of the Tigris River. In this ancient place where empires had risen and fallen for thousands of years, a child was born who would one day shake the foundations of the medieval world. The year was around 1137, and the baby's name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History would remember him as Saladin. The world into which Saladin was born was a dangerous and divided place. The great Islamic empire that had once stretched from Spain to India was broken into many small pieces. Muslim rulers fought each other constantly, while Christian Crusader armies held important cities along the Mediterranean coast. For nearly 40 years, these foreign invaders had controlled Jerusalem. The third holiest city in Islam. Saladin's family were Kurds, a proud mountain people who had served as soldiers and administrators throughout the Muslim world for centuries. The Kurds had their own language and customs, but they were also deeply committed to Islam. They were known for their loyalty, their courage in battle, and their skill in governing the complex societies of the Middle East. His father, Nam ad-Din Ayyub, was a military commander who served the powerful Zengid dynasty. The Zengids ruled parts of Syria and northern Iraq from their capitals in Aleppo and Mosul. They were among the few Muslim rulers who took the threat of the Crusaders seriously and actually fought against them instead of just talking about holy war. Saladin's uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, was even more important in the Zengid military hierarchy. Shirkuh was a brilliant general and a master of political intrigue. He would become the most important influence on young Saladin's life, teaching him not just how to fight, but how to think like a leader in a world where today's ally might be tomorrow's enemy. The first great crisis of Saladin's childhood came when he was still very young. His father was accused of some wrongdoing by his superiors in Tikrit. The exact nature of the accusation is lost to history, but it was serious enough that the entire family had to flee their home in the middle of the night. They lost everything they owned and had to start over in exile. This experience taught Saladin important lessons that would shape his entire life. He learned that power could disappear in an instant if you were not careful. He learned that even faithful service might not protect you from the jealousy and ambition of others. Most importantly, he learned that justice was rare in the world, and that if you wanted to create a just society, you had to be strong enough to protect it. The family found refuge in Mosul, where Shirkuh had influence with the Zengid ruler, Imad ad-Din Zengi. Zengi was one of the most feared and respected Muslim leaders of his time. He had recaptured the important Crusader city of Edessa in 1144, proving that the Christian invaders could be defeated if Muslims worked together. In Mosul, young Saladin received the education of a Muslim nobleman. He learned to read and write Arabic perfectly. He studied the Quran and Islamic law with some of the finest scholars in the Muslim world. He learned mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Most importantly, he studied history, learning about the great Muslim leaders of the past and how they had built and maintained their empires. But Saladin was not just a bookish prince. He also trained constantly in the arts of war. He learned to ride a horse almost before he could walk properly. He practiced with sword and lance until his movements became as natural as breathing. He studied the tactics of great generals and learned how to command men in battle. The most important part of his education, however, came from watching and listening to the political discussions around him. The Zengid court was a place where ambitious men plotted constantly. Saladin observed how alliances were made and broken. He learned to read the expressions on men's faces and understand what they really meant when they spoke. He began to understand that war was only one tool of leadership, and often not the most important one. When Saladin was about 10 years old, his family moved again, this time to Aleppo. His uncle Shirkuh had become one of the most trusted generals of Nur ad-Din, the son of Imad ad-Din Zengi. Nur ad-Din was even more determined than his father to unite the Muslim world and drive out the Crusaders. He was also more religious and more just in his dealings with his subjects. In Aleppo, Saladin saw a different kind of Muslim society. Nur ad-Din tried to rule according to Islamic law and justice. He built schools and hospitals. He encouraged trade and learning. He treated Christians and Jews fairly, even though he was fighting against Christian crusaders. Saladin began to understand that a Muslim leader could be both a holy warrior and a just ruler. The young man also witnessed the constant diplomatic activity that was necessary to hold together even a small Muslim state. Ambassadors came and went constantly. Treaties were negotiated, broken, and renegotiated. Saladin learned that in the divided world of the 12th century, survival often depended more on clever diplomacy than on military strength. During his teenage years, Saladin began to accompany his uncle on military campaigns. He learned that real war was very different from the romantic stories told by poets. He saw men die in terrible ways. He witnessed the suffering of common people caught between opposing armies. But he also saw acts of great courage and nobility that inspired him to believe that warfare could be conducted with honor. The most important lesson of his youth came from observing the behavior of other Muslim rulers. Time and again he saw leaders who put their own interests ahead of the welfare of their people or the cause of Islam. He watched as Muslim armies fought each other while Christian crusaders grew stronger. He began to develop a burning conviction that the Muslim world needed a leader who would put the common good ahead of personal ambition. Saladin also learned about the Crusaders themselves during these years. Unlike many Muslims who saw all Christians as evil barbarians, Saladin came to understand that the Crusader nobles often followed their own code of honor. He learned that some Christian knights could be trusted to keep their word, while others could not. This knowledge would serve him well in later years when he had to negotiate with Crusader leaders. By the time Saladin reached adulthood, he had become a skilled warrior, a careful student of politics, and a devout Muslim who believed deeply in justice and mercy. He had also developed an unshakable conviction that his destiny was to unite the Muslim world and recapture Jerusalem from the Crusaders. The experiences of his childhood and youth had forged him into exactly the kind of leader the Muslim world needed. He understood both war and peace, both the necessity of force and the importance of mercy. Most importantly, he had learned to think beyond his own immediate interests and consider the welfare of the entire Islamic community. The stage was set for Saladin to begin his rise to power, a rise that would transform him from an obscure Kurdish soldier into the most feared and respected Muslim leader of the medieval world. The bells of Poitiers Cathedral rang out across the rolling hills of Aquitaine on a crisp September morning in 1157. In the great palace nearby, A son was born to one of the most powerful couples in medieval Europe. The baby's name was Richard, and he would grow up to become one of the most famous warriors in all of Christian history. Richard's mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose very name made kings tremble and poets sing. She had already been Queen of France and had traveled to the Holy Land on the Second Crusade. Now she was Queen of England, married to Henry II Plantagenet. Eleanor controlled vast lands in southwestern France that were richer and more sophisticated than most kingdoms of that time. Richard's father, Henry II, ruled an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains. He was one of the most intelligent and energetic kings of his age, but also one of the most violent and unpredictable. Henry had fought his way to the English throne and held it through constant warfare and political maneuvering. The world into which Richard was born was very different from the one that shaped Saladin. While the Muslim world was divided and struggling, Western Europe was experiencing a time of growth and change. New towns were being built, trade was expanding, and a new class of knights was developing ideas about honor, courage, and romantic love. Richard spent most of his childhood not in England, but in his mother's lands in Aquitaine and Poitou. This was a region famous for its troubadours, poet-musicians who created songs about brave knights and beautiful ladies. From his earliest years, Richard heard stories that made war seem glorious and knighthood the highest calling a man could follow. Eleanor made sure her son learned everything a medieval prince needed to know. He studied Latin with learned clerks and could read the great works of ancient Rome. He learned mathematics and basic medicine. He studied the art of falconry, a sport beloved by the nobility. Most importantly, he learned the complex rules of chivalry that were supposed to govern the behavior of knights. But Richard showed little interest in scholarly pursuits. His passion was for physical activities. He loved to hunt wild boar in the thick forests of Aquitaine. He practiced constantly with sword and lance. By the time he was 12 years old, he could handle a war horse with the skill of a veteran knight. His tutors noticed that he seemed to come alive only when he was engaged in some form of combat or competition. The young prince also learned the harsh realities of medieval politics through his own family's bitter conflicts. The Plantagenet family was famous for their violent quarrels. Henry II had 4 sons, and they spent much of their time plotting against their father and each other. Richard learned early that even the closest family bonds meant nothing when power was at stake. When Richard was 14 years old, his father gave him control of Aquitaine. This was not just an honorary title. Richard was expected to actually rule these lands, collect taxes, command armies, and keep the peace among the quarrelsome nobles. It was an enormous responsibility for such a young man, but Richard proved he was ready for it. His first real test came when several Aquitanian nobles rebelled against his authority. These were experienced warriors who thought they could easily defeat a teenage prince. They were badly mistaken. Richard raised an army with lightning speed and crushed the rebellion with a combination of military skill and ruthless determination. He showed no mercy to the rebels, executing their leaders and destroying their castles. This early success established Richard's reputation as a formidable military commander. But it also revealed a dark side to his character. Richard could be incredibly cruel to his enemies. He seemed to enjoy the violence of war in a way that disturbed even his own supporters. Some historians believe this cruelty came from the constant warfare he witnessed in his own family. The most defining experience of Richard's youth was his relationship with his father. Henry II was a brilliant king, but he was also a suspicious and controlling man who found it difficult to trust anyone, even his own sons. He repeatedly promised to give Richard more power and independence, then broke those promises when it suited his political needs. Richard's response was to rebel against his father, sometimes alone, sometimes in alliance with his brothers or with the King of France. These rebellions were not just political disputes. They were genuine wars with real battles and real casualties. Father and son faced each other across battlefields multiple times, each trying to destroy the other. The most serious rebellion came in 1173 when Richard was only 16 years old. He joined with his brothers Henry and Geoffrey in a massive revolt supported by the King of France, the King of Scotland, and many English and Norman nobles. The war lasted for over a year and devastated large parts of England and France. During this conflict, Richard proved that his early military successes had not been accidents. He showed remarkable skill in siege warfare, capturing several important castles. He also demonstrated the personal courage that would later earn him his famous nickname. Richard always fought in the front lines, sharing the dangers faced by his common soldiers, but the rebellion ultimately failed. Henry II proved that he was still the master of medieval warfare. One by one, he defeated his enemies and forced his sons to surrender. Richard had to kneel before his father and beg for forgiveness. It was a humiliating experience that left lasting scars on the young prince's pride. The pattern repeated itself several times over the next 15 years. Richard would rebel, fight brilliantly for a while, then be forced to submit when his father's superior resources and political skills proved decisive. Each cycle of rebellion and submission taught Richard important lessons about the realities of power, but it also filled him with bitter resentment against the man who had given him life. Richard's education in warfare was not limited to fighting his own family. Aquitaine was a turbulent region where ambitious nobles constantly challenged ducal authority. Richard spent most of his young adulthood campaigning against rebellious vassals, defending his borders against neighboring rulers and suppressing bandits who threatened trade routes. These constant conflicts turned Richard into one of the finest military commanders of his generation. He learned how to take castles that seemed impregnable. He mastered the art of moving armies quickly across difficult terrain. Most importantly, he developed an almost supernatural ability to inspire his soldiers to fight beyond their normal limits. But Richard's military education came at a cost. The constant warfare made him impatient with the slower processes of diplomacy and administration. He preferred to solve problems with his sword rather than with negotiations. This preference for violence over politics would shape his entire approach to kingship. By the time Richard reached his 30s, he had become famous throughout Europe as one of the greatest knights of his age. Troubadours sang songs about his victories. Other nobles sought his friendship or feared his enmity. When he finally became King of England in 1189 after his father's death, he was already a legend, but Richard's true test was still to come. Soon, he would face an enemy unlike any he had encountered in the petty wars of Western Europe. In the Holy Land, Saladin was waiting with an army that had conquered Jerusalem and united the Muslim world. The stage was set for a confrontation between two of the greatest military minds of the medieval age. The year was 1164, and the ancient land of Egypt was dying. The once mighty Fatimid Caliphate that had ruled the Nile for over 2 centuries was crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. Different factions fought for control while the people suffered from famine, disease, and constant warfare. It was into this chaos that a young Kurdish soldier named Saladin would step, beginning a rise to power that would change the course of history. Saladin was 27 years old when his uncle, Shirkuh, received orders from Nur ad-Din to lead an army into Egypt. The mission seemed simple enough. The Fatimid vizier had asked for help against a rival who was being supported by the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem. But Saladin understood that this expedition would determine the future of the entire region. Egypt was the greatest prize in the medieval Middle East. The Nile River made its lands incredibly fertile, producing enough grain to feed armies and enough wealth to buy the loyalty of countless warriors. Whoever controlled Egypt would have the resources to challenge the Crusader states and potentially unite the entire Muslim world. The journey to Egypt was Saladin's first major military campaign outside of Syria. He rode beside his uncle through the scorching deserts of Sinai, leading a column of tough Kurdish and Turkish cavalry. These were professional soldiers who had spent their lives fighting, but even they were impressed by the young man's calm confidence and natural leadership abilities. When Shirkuh's army arrived in Egypt, they found a situation more complicated than anyone had expected. The Fatimid government was completely corrupt and powerless. Different military commanders controlled different parts of the country. Some were loyal to the Fatimid Caliph, others supported various pretenders to the throne, and still others simply fought for whoever paid them the most money. Even worse for the Muslims, a Crusader army from Jerusalem had also arrived in Egypt. The Christian knights were not there to conquer the country directly, but to make sure that whatever government emerged would be friendly to the Crusader states. For the first time in his life, Saladin found himself fighting against the legendary Frankish heavy cavalry that had terrorized Muslim armies for decades. The young Kurdish warrior quickly proved that he had inherited more than just his uncle's courage. In several small battles against both Egyptian factions and Crusader forces, Saladin showed remarkable tactical skill. He learned to use the mobility of his light cavalry to avoid the devastating charges of Christian knights, then strike at their flanks when they were exhausted and disorganized. But Saladin's real education during this campaign came from watching the political maneuvering around him. His uncle Shirkuh was not just a general but a master diplomat, who understood that military victory meant nothing without political success. Saladin observed how alliances were made and broken, how gold could be more effective than steel, and how the right words at the right time could accomplish more than 1,000 swords. The expedition to Egypt lasted for 3 years, with Shirkuh's army advancing and retreating several times as the political situation changed. Finally, in 1169, Shirkuh managed to become the power behind the Fatimid throne by eliminating his rivals and convincing the weak Fatimid caliph to appoint him as vizier. It seemed like a complete victory for Nur ad-Din and his Syrian forces, then disaster struck. Just 2 months after achieving his greatest triumph, Shirkuh died suddenly, probably from a heart attack brought on by his years of hard campaigning. The Syrian army found itself in a very dangerous position. They were surrounded by potential enemies in a foreign country, with their leader dead and no clear successor. What happened next surprised everyone, including Saladin himself. The Fatimid caliph, desperate to maintain some stability, appointed the young Kurdish soldier as the new vizier of Egypt. At the age of 31, Saladin suddenly found himself the effective ruler of the richest country in the Muslim world. Many people expected Saladin's reign to be very short. He was young and relatively inexperienced. He was a foreigner in a land with its own proud traditions. Most importantly, he was a Sunni Muslim trying to rule a Shia country whose religious leaders saw him as a heretic. Rebellions broke out almost immediately, led by Fatimid officials who thought they could easily overthrow this Kurdish upstart. But Saladin proved to be much more clever and ruthless than his enemies had expected. Instead of trying to rule through force alone, he began a careful campaign to win over the Egyptian people. He kept most of the existing government officials in their positions, showing that he respected Egyptian traditions. He spent large amounts of money on public works projects, rebuilding mosques and improving the irrigation systems that kept the Nile Valley fertile. At the same time, Saladin quietly eliminated his most dangerous enemies. Some were killed in battle, others died under mysterious circumstances, and still others simply disappeared. Within 2 years, all serious opposition to his rule had been crushed or neutralized. The most daring move of Saladin's early reign came in 1171. In a carefully planned ceremony, he ended the Shia Fatimid Caliphate that had ruled Egypt for over 2 centuries. Instead of the Fatimid Caliph, prayers in Cairo's mosques now mentioned the Sunni Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. With this single act, Saladin returned Egypt to what most Muslims considered Orthodox Islam. This religious change was more than just symbolic. It meant that Egypt was now theoretically part of the same Islamic community as Syria, Iraq, and the other Sunni Muslim lands. For the first time in generations, there was a real possibility that the Muslim world could be united under a single leader. Nur ad-Din, Saladin's nominal superior in Damascus, watched these developments with growing concern. He had sent Saladin to Egypt as his representative, but it was becoming clear that the young Kurd was building his own independent power base. Letters flew back and forth between Damascus and Cairo as the two men tried to determine who was really in charge. The situation became even more tense when Saladin began expanding his control beyond Egypt itself. He sent armies into the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, capturing several important fortresses. He also began interfering in the politics of southern Arabia and the African coast. These were the actions of an independent ruler, not a loyal subordinate. By 1174, it was clear that a confrontation between Nur ad-Din and Saladin was inevitable. Both men were gathering their forces for what promised to be a decisive battle that would determine the future leadership of the Muslim world. Then, just as the crisis reached its peak, Nur ad-Din died suddenly in Damascus. The death of his former master left Saladin in a unique position. He controlled the richest Muslim country through his base in Egypt. The other Syrian rulers were divided and weak. For the first time since the death of the great Harun al-Rashid 3 centuries earlier, there was a real opportunity for someone to unite the entire Muslim Middle East under a single government. Saladin did not hesitate. Within months of Nur ad-Din's death, he had marched his Egyptian army into Syria and begun the systematic conquest of the divided Muslim principalities. Some cities surrendered without a fight, recognizing that resistance was hopeless. Others had to be taken by siege, but Saladin's combination of military skill and political wisdom proved irresistible. By 1183, Saladin controlled everything from the Nile to the Euphrates. The dream that had begun in his youth, the vision of a united Muslim world strong enough to drive out the Crusaders, was finally becoming reality. The stage was set for the greatest achievement of his career, the reconquest of Jerusalem and the defeat of the Crusader states that had humiliated the Muslim world for nearly a century. The messenger rode his horse nearly to death crossing the mountains and valleys of Europe in the autumn of 1187. His news was so terrible that many people refused to believe it at first. Jerusalem, the holy city that had been in Christian hands for 88 years, had fallen to the Muslim armies of Saladin. The greatest defeat in Crusader history had shattered the kingdom of Jerusalem and left the other Crusader states fighting for their very survival. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, had been a complete disaster for the Christians. Almost the entire military nobility of the Crusader states had been killed or captured. King Guy of Jerusalem was Saladin's prisoner. The True Cross, the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, had been taken by Muslim soldiers. Worse still, Saladin's army was now marching unopposed toward Jerusalem itself. When the news reached Europe, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Pope Urban III was said to have died of shock upon hearing the report. His successor, Pope Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade to recapture the Holy Land. Church bells rang out across Europe, calling Christian knights to take up the cross once again. In England, King Henry II received the news while he was dealing with yet another rebellion by his sons. The old king was growing tired and sick, worn down by decades of constant warfare and political intrigue. But even Henry understood that this crisis was bigger than his family disputes. The loss of Jerusalem threatened the very foundations of Christian civilization. Richard Plantagenet was at his castle in Poitiers when a travel-stained messenger brought him the terrible news. The prince was 30 years old and at the height of his physical powers. He had spent the previous decade fighting rebellious nobles in Aquitaine and had earned a reputation as one of the finest knights in Europe. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for news like this. Richard's first reaction was not grief or despair, but a burning rage that seemed to consume him completely. Witnesses later said that the prince's face turned red as fire and his hands shook with fury. How dare these Muslim infidels capture the city where Christ himself had died and risen again? How dare they humiliate the flower of Christian knighthood? Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. Without hesitation, Richard announced that he would take the cross and join the new crusade. This was not just a political decision for the ambitious prince. Richard had been raised on stories of the glorious First Crusade, when brave Christian knights had carved out kingdoms in the Holy Land and recaptured Jerusalem from the infidels. His own great-grandfather had died fighting Muslims in Spain. Military glory and religious duty were perfectly combined in the idea of crusading. But Richard also understood that leading a successful crusade would establish him as the greatest king in Europe. His father Henry II was old and sick. His main rival for influence was Philip Augustus, the clever young king of France. If Richard could succeed where so many others had failed, if he could defeat the legendary Saladin and recapture Jerusalem, he would win fame that would last for centuries. The practical problems of organizing a crusade were enormous. Medieval armies were incredibly expensive to maintain. Knights had to buy their own equipment, horses, and supplies. Ships had to be hired to transport men and materials across the Mediterranean. Food and water had to be arranged for an army that might campaign for years in foreign lands. Richard threw himself into these preparations with the same energy he had always shown in warfare. He began selling everything he could to raise money for the expedition. Royal lands, castles, and even government offices were put up for sale. Richard reportedly said that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer rich enough to afford it. The prince also had to deal with the complex politics of organizing a joint crusade with other European rulers. King Philip Augustus of France had also taken the cross, despite the fact that he and Richard had been fighting each other for years. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was preparing his own massive expedition from Germany. Somehow, all these different armies would have to work together in the Holy Land. Richard's relationship with his father became even more strained during this period. Henry II was suspicious of his son's crusading plans, wondering if Richard was just looking for an excuse to gain independent resources and allies. The old king also worried about what would happen to his vast empire while Richard was away fighting in the east. These family tensions exploded into open warfare in 1188 when Richard allied himself with King Philip of France against his own father. The war was brief but brutal, with Richard proving once again that he was willing to fight anyone who stood in his way, even his own parent. Henry II was forced to flee from castle to castle as his son's army conquered large parts of his French territories. The conflict finally ended in July 1189 when Henry II died at the castle of Chinon, defeated and broken by years of struggle against his rebellious sons. Some chroniclers wrote that Henry's last words were a curse upon all his children. Richard had won his independence, but at the cost of his father's life and his own reputation for filial loyalty. Now King Richard I of England, the new monarch, immediately began preparing for the greatest military expedition of the medieval age. He inherited vast territories in France and England, but he saw them mainly as sources of money and men for his crusade. Richard spent only a few months in England during his entire 10-year reign, treating his kingdom as a bank to finance his military adventures. The new king's preparations were methodical and ruthless. He reorganized the government of England to function without him, appointing capable administrators who could collect taxes and maintain order in his absence. He crushed a series of anti-Jewish riots that threatened to disrupt his fundraising efforts. He even negotiated with his brother John and other potential rivals, buying their loyalty with grants of land and money. Most importantly, Richard began assembling what would become the largest and best equipped crusading army ever sent to the Holy Land. English knights were joined by warriors from all over Europe who were attracted by Richard's reputation and his obvious determination to succeed. The expedition would include some of the finest military engineers, the best siege equipment, and the most experienced soldiers available. By the spring of 1190, everything was ready. Richard had raised an enormous treasure to finance the expedition. He had assembled a powerful army and a large fleet of ships. He had made alliances with other crusading leaders and arranged for the governance of his lands during his absence. Most importantly, he had developed a clear strategy for defeating Saladin and recapturing Jerusalem. The moment of departure finally arrived in July 1190, when Richard met King Philip of France at the town of Vézelay. The two kings, despite their long history of conflict, pledged to work together for the success of the crusade. Their combined armies then began the long journey toward the Holy Land and a confrontation with the man who had humiliated all of Christendom. Richard had no way of knowing that he was about to face an enemy unlike any he had encountered in the petty wars of Western Europe. Saladin was not just a skilled general but a master of strategy and diplomacy, who had united the Muslim world for the first time in centuries. The stage was set for a clash between two of the greatest military minds of the medieval age, a confrontation that would test everything both men had learned about war, leadership, and honor. The Mediterranean Sea sparkled like liquid gold in the summer sun of 1191 as Richard's massive fleet approached the coast of the Holy Land. After nearly 2 years of preparation and travel, the Lionheart was finally ready to test his strength against the legendary Saladin. What neither man could have predicted was that their confrontation would become one of the most remarkable displays of military genius and personal honor in all of medieval history. Richard's first sight of the Holy Land was the ancient city of Acre, which had been under siege by Christian forces for almost 2 years. The siege had become a nightmare for both sides. Thousands of crusaders had died from disease and starvation while camped outside the city's massive walls. Inside Acre, the Muslim garrison was equally desperate, surrounded by enemies and cut off from relief by Saladin's inability to break through the crusader lines. When Richard arrived at Acre in June 1191, he immediately transformed the entire character of the siege. The English king brought with him the finest siege engines that medieval technology could produce. Massive catapults called mangonels hurled huge stones at the city walls day and night. Giant crossbows shot iron bolts that could pierce any armor. Most terrifying of all were Richard's sappers, expert engineers who began digging tunnels under the walls to bring them crashing down. But Richard's greatest weapon was his own personality. The Crusader army had been demoralized by 2 years of failure and the constant bickering between its leaders. Richard's arrival gave them new hope and energy. The English king led from the front, sharing the dangers faced by common soldiers and inspiring them with his courage and determination. Saladin watched these developments with growing concern from his camp on the hills overlooking Acre. The Muslim leader had defeated every Crusader army for the past 4 years, but he recognized that Richard was different from previous opponents. This was not just another European noble looking for easy glory, but a genuine military genius who understood both strategy and tactics. The final assault on Acre began on July 11, 1191. Richard's siege engines had opened several large breaches in the city walls, and his soldiers poured through like an unstoppable flood. The Muslim garrison fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. After a battle that lasted all day, the defenders finally surrendered. The fall of Acre was Saladin's first major defeat since he had begun his campaign against the Crusader states. But what happened next would haunt the relationship between the two leaders for the rest of their lives. Richard had captured nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, including many important nobles and soldiers. According to the surrender agreement, Saladin was supposed to pay a huge ransom for their release and return the true cross that had been captured at Hattin. When Saladin delayed in paying the ransom, Richard made a decision that shocked even his own supporters. On August 20, 1191, he ordered the mass execution of all the Muslim prisoners. The slaughter was carried out in full view of Saladin's army, which was camped close enough to watch in horror as their comrades were butchered. This brutal act revealed a dark side to Richard's character that contradicted all the ideals of chivalry and honor that he claimed to follow. Some historians argue that Richard was simply being practical, that he could not afford to guard so many prisoners while continuing his campaign. Others believe that he was trying to terrorize Saladin into making quick decisions in future negotiations. Whatever his motives, the massacre at Acre changed the nature of the conflict between Richard and Saladin. What had begun as a relatively civilized war between honorable enemies now became a much more bitter and personal struggle. Saladin swore that he would never again show mercy to any of Richard's soldiers who fell into his hands. Despite this terrible beginning, the military confrontation between the two leaders quickly developed into something resembling a deadly chess match. Both men were masters of medieval warfare, and each move by one was countered by an equally clever response from the other. Richard's next objective was the city of Jerusalem, but Saladin was determined not to let the Crusader army reach the Holy City. The Muslim leader decided to use the classic strategy of the desert warrior, harassing the enemy with constant hit-and-run attacks while avoiding any decisive battle that might give Richard a chance to use his heavy cavalry effectively. The march from Acre toward Jerusalem became one of the most famous military operations in medieval history. Richard organized his army into a tight formation that could resist Saladin's tactics. The heavily armored knights rode in the center, protected by ranks of crossbowmen and infantry. The entire army moved slowly but steadily along the coast, staying close to their supply ships and never giving Saladin an opportunity for a successful ambush. Saladin's response was to attack constantly with his swift horse archers. These skilled warriors would ride close to the Crusader column, shoot clouds of arrows, then retreat before the Christian knights could catch them. Day after day, week after week, the Muslim cavalry nibbled at the edges of Richard's army like wolves attacking a flock of sheep. The climax of this deadly dance came on September 7, 1191. Near the town of Arsuf, Saladin had finally assembled his entire army for a massive assault designed to destroy Richard's forces once and for all. The Muslim attack began at dawn with thousands of mounted archers shooting arrows so thick they darkened the sky. Richard's response showed why he was considered one of the greatest military commanders of his age. Despite the terrible pressure from Saladin's attacks, he kept his army in perfect formation for hours, waiting for exactly the right moment to counterattack. His soldiers were dying around him, but Richard held them steady through sheer force of will and personal example. Finally, when Saladin's horses were exhausted and his archers had used most of their arrows, Richard gave the signal for a general charge. The Christian heavy cavalry thundered forward like an avalanche, their 12-foot lances lowered and their war cries echoing across the battlefield. The impact was devastating. Saladin's army scattered like leaves before a hurricane. But Saladin's genius showed in defeat as well as victory. Instead of letting his army be completely destroyed, he managed an organized retreat that saved most of his forces. Within days, the Muslim army was reformed and ready to continue the campaign. Richard had won a great tactical victory, but Saladin had preserved his strategic position. The Battle of Arsuf established both leaders as military equals. Richard had proven that Crusader heavy cavalry could still dominate a medieval battlefield when properly used. Saladin had shown that, even in defeat, a skilled commander could minimize his losses and continue the fight. The two armies continued their deadly dance for months, with Richard advancing toward Jerusalem and Saladin retreating just far enough to avoid a decisive battle. 3 separate times, Richard came within sight of the Holy City. 3 times, he was forced to retreat when Saladin cut his supply lines or threatened to attack his base at Acre. By the end of 1192, both leaders understood that neither could achieve total victory. Richard lacked the resources for a long siege of Jerusalem. Saladin could not risk the destruction of his army in a final battle. The stage was set for negotiations that would test their diplomatic skills as thoroughly as the previous battles had tested their military abilities. The year 1192 brought dark clouds over both the Christian and Muslim camps in the Holy Land. What had begun as a glorious crusade for Richard and a holy war for Saladin had become a grinding test of endurance that pushed both leaders to the very limits of their strength and wisdom. The greatest challenges they would face came not from enemy swords, but from within their own ranks and from the cruel hand of fate itself. For Saladin, the most painful blow came not in battle but in his own family tent. His beloved son Al-Afdal, a brave young warrior who had fought beside his father in many campaigns, was captured during a skirmish with Crusader forces near Jaffa. The news struck Saladin like a physical blow. Witnesses said the great Sultan wept openly when he heard that his son was now a prisoner in Richard's camp. Al-Afdal was not just any prisoner. He was Saladin's chosen heir, the young man being groomed to carry on his father's work of keeping the Muslim world united. More than that, he was Saladin's favorite child, the son who most resembled his father in courage and intelligence. The capture was both a personal tragedy and a political disaster. Richard's messengers soon arrived with an offer that tested Saladin's deepest principles. The English king was willing to trade Al-Afdal for the True Cross and a massive ransom in gold. It was exactly the kind of deal that medieval rulers made all the time. Families were more important than politics, and even the greatest leaders were expected to put their children's welfare above everything else. But Saladin surprised everyone, including his own advisors, with his response. He refused to make any special arrangements for his son's release. Al-Afdal would be treated like any other prisoner, no better and no worse. The young man would have to wait until a general prisoner exchange could be arranged as part of a broader peace agreement. This decision revealed the true greatness of Saladin's character, but it also showed the terrible price that leadership demanded. Night after night, the Sultan lay awake in his tent, tormented by visions of his son suffering in a Christian dungeon. His other children and his wives begged him to reconsider, but Saladin held firm. He could not betray the trust of the thousands of other Muslim prisoners by giving his own family special treatment. The strain of this personal agony was made worse by growing political problems within Saladin's own coalition. Many of the Muslim rulers who had joined his army were becoming restless after months of inconclusive campaigning. They had expected a quick victory that would drive the Crusaders into the sea. Instead, they found themselves locked in an endless war against an enemy who seemed impossible to defeat completely. Saladin's nephew, Taqi ad-Din, became the leader of a faction that openly questioned the Sultan's strategy. These critics argued that Saladin was being too cautious, that he should risk everything in one massive battle rather than continue the slow war of attrition. They whispered that perhaps the great leader was getting old and losing his nerve. The criticism hurt Saladin deeply because there was some truth in it. He was now in his 50s, an old man by medieval standards. The constant stress of command was wearing him down physically and mentally. His hair had turned completely gray, and he suffered from frequent illnesses that left him weak and exhausted. Even worse, Saladin began receiving disturbing reports from other parts of his empire. Local governors in Egypt and Syria were taking advantage of his absence to increase their own power. Some were even making secret deals with Crusader merchants, putting personal profit ahead of the Holy War. The great coalition that Saladin had spent decades building was starting to crack under the pressure of prolonged warfare. Meanwhile, in the Christian camp, Richard was facing equally serious challenges. The most immediate crisis came from Europe, where his enemies were taking advantage of his absence to attack his lands. King Philip Augustus of France had returned from the crusade early and was now actively plotting to seize Richard's territories in Normandy and Aquitaine. Even more dangerous was the news that Richard's own brother John was stirring up rebellion in England. John had never been content with the lands and titles that Richard had given him. Now he saw an opportunity to seize the crown itself while his brother was thousands of miles away fighting Muslims. Letters arrived almost daily begging Richard to return home before he lost everything he had inherited from his father. The English king's response to these threats revealed both his strengths and his fatal weaknesses. Richard refused to abandon his crusade despite the growing dangers to his kingdom. He was determined to achieve the glory that would come from recapturing Jerusalem, even if it cost him his throne. This obsession with military honor would shape all his decisions for the rest of his life. But Richard's greatest trial came from his own body. In the summer of 1192, he fell seriously ill with a fever that brought him close to death. Some chroniclers said it was malaria, others believed it was typhus or dysentery. Whatever the disease, it left the mighty warrior helpless for weeks, burning with fever and delirious with pain. During Richard's illness, his army began to fall apart. Many knights decided that God was punishing the expedition and returned to Europe. Others lost faith in their leader's judgment and began making their own plans for the future. The great Crusader host that had seemed invincible just months earlier was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Saladin learned of Richard's illness through his network of spies and faced a terrible moral dilemma. Islamic military tradition allowed him to attack a weakened enemy without mercy. This might be his best chance to destroy the Crusader army completely and end the war with total victory. But Saladin chose a different path, one that would define his reputation for centuries to come. Instead of attacking, he sent his personal physician to treat Richard's illness. Along with the doctor came gifts of fresh fruit and ice from the mountains of Lebanon to help reduce the English king's fever. It was an act of chivalry that amazed both armies and created a bond of respect between the two leaders that would last for the rest of their lives. Richard's recovery was slow and incomplete. Even after the fever broke, he remained weak and exhausted. The disease had aged him dramatically, and he would never again possess the superhuman energy that had made him famous. Yet he continued to lead his reduced army with the same courage that had always marked his character. The final challenge for both leaders came with the gradual realization that neither could achieve the total victory they had originally sought. Richard's dream of recapturing Jerusalem was clearly impossible with his weakened forces. Saladin's hope of driving all the Crusaders from the Holy Land was equally unrealistic given the strength of their coastal fortresses. This mutual recognition of military reality forced both men to consider something that neither had wanted to contemplate: a negotiated peace that would leave both sides with less than their maximum goals. It was a bitter pill for two warriors who had spent their entire lives believing that any problem could be solved with sufficient courage and determination. Yet, even as they prepared for the difficult negotiations that lay ahead, both Richard and Saladin had learned something valuable from their trials. They had discovered that true greatness lay not just in winning victories, but in maintaining honor and dignity even in the face of defeat and disappointment. The challenges they had overcome would make them both wiser leaders and, ultimately, worthier adversaries. The scorching summer of 1192 was drawing to a close when two of the greatest enemies in medieval history finally acknowledged what their advisors had been whispering for months. Neither Richard the Lionheart nor Saladin could achieve the total victory they had dreamed of when this holy war began. The time had come for these master warriors to test their skills at the equally challenging art of making peace. The first tentative contacts between the two camps came through an unlikely mediator. Saladin's brother, Aladil, had developed a genuine respect for Richard during their brief encounters on the battlefield. Unlike many Muslim commanders who saw the Crusaders as nothing more than barbaric invaders, Aladil recognized that Richard followed his own code of honor, even if it was very different from Islamic ideals. Aladil approached his brother with a radical suggestion. Instead of continuing this destructive war that was bleeding both sides white, why not try to find a solution that would allow both leaders to claim some measure of success? Saladin listened carefully to his brother's words, recognizing the wisdom in them even though his heart still burned for complete victory. The initial negotiations were conducted through a series of carefully arranged meetings between Aladil and Richard's most trusted knights. These talks took place in a large tent pitched halfway between the two armies, with both sides agreeing that the negotiators would be protected by sacred oaths that even enemies honored. What emerged from these early discussions surprised everyone involved. Despite never having met face-to-face during the war, Richard and Saladin had developed an extraordinary understanding of each other's character and motivations. Each man recognized in his opponent the same commitment to honor, the same devotion to his followers, and the same willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for a greater cause. Richard made the first major concession when he acknowledged that Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. This decision shocked his own supporters, many of whom had traveled thousands of miles specifically to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The English king explained his reasoning with typical bluntness. His army was too small and too weakened by disease to conduct a successful siege of such a strongly fortified city, but Richard's concession came with important conditions. If Christians could not rule Jerusalem, they must at least be allowed to visit it. Pilgrims from Europe had been traveling to the Holy Land for centuries before the Crusades began. This ancient tradition must be restored, allowing peaceful Christians to worship at the sites where Jesus had lived and died. Saladin's response to this request revealed the depth of his own character. The great Sultan could easily have refused, arguing that Christian pilgrims might be spies or troublemakers. Instead, he agreed immediately to guarantee safe passage for all peaceful pilgrims, regardless of their nationality or social status. More than that, he promised that Christian priests would be allowed to serve in Jerusalem as churches and that Christian merchants could trade freely throughout his territories. The most difficult part of the negotiations involved the territorial divisions that would separate Christian and Muslim lands. Richard insisted on keeping control of the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, arguing that the Crusader states needed access to the sea for trade and communication with Europe. Saladin agreed to this demand but required that the Christians give up their claims to all the inland territories, including the important cities of Hebron and Bethlehem. Both sides had to make painful sacrifices to reach this agreement. Richard was forced to abandon several inland castles that his forces had captured at great cost in men and money. Saladin had to accept the continued existence of Crusader states that he had hoped to eliminate completely. Yet both leaders understood that these compromises were necessary to end a war that was destroying both their peoples. The final negotiations were conducted by Richard and Aladil in person, as the two leaders had developed a genuine friendship despite the warfare raging around them. These meetings revealed a side of Richard's character that few people ever saw. Away from the battlefield, The English king could be charming, witty, and surprisingly thoughtful about the complexities of governing diverse populations. Al-Adil was equally impressed by Richard's willingness to listen to Muslim perspectives on the conflict. The Crusader king asked detailed questions about Islamic law and customs, showing a genuine desire to understand his former enemies. This intellectual curiosity surprised the Muslim negotiator, who had expected to deal with a simple-minded barbarian interested only in violence and plunder. The final terms of what became known as the Treaty of Jaffa were agreed upon in September 1192. The document was remarkably detailed for a medieval peace agreement, covering everything from trade regulations to the treatment of prisoners of war. Both sides agreed to a 3-year truce that could be renewed if both parties wished to continue the peace. Under the treaty's terms, the Crusader states would retain control of a narrow strip of territory along the Mediterranean coast. This area included the vital ports of Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa, giving the Christians the sea access they needed to maintain contact with Europe. Saladin would control all the inland territories, including Jerusalem and the other holy cities that were so important to Muslim identity. The agreement also included specific provisions for the treatment of pilgrims and merchants. Christians would be allowed to visit Jerusalem and other holy sites without paying special taxes or facing harassment from Muslim authorities. Similarly, Muslim merchants would be free to trade in Christian territories under the same conditions that applied to their Christian counterparts. Most remarkably, the treaty included a personal exchange of gifts between Richard and Saladin that demonstrated the mutual respect that had grown between these former enemies. Richard sent Saladin a magnificent warhorse, one of the finest animals in his stable. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, acknowledging Saladin's skill as a cavalry commander while offering a gift that any warrior would treasure. Saladin's response was equally thoughtful. He sent Richard a selection of the finest silks and spices from the markets of Damascus, along with a beautiful sword that had been crafted by the greatest metalworkers in the Islamic world. The blade was inscribed with verses from the Quran that spoke of honor, justice, and the mercy that victorious warriors should show their defeated enemies. The signing ceremony for the Treaty of Jaffa was conducted with all the dignity that two great civilizations could provide. Representatives from both armies witnessed the agreement, swearing sacred oaths that their leaders would honor its terms. For the first time in years, Christian and Muslim soldiers stood side by side without weapons in their hands, united in their hope that the killing would finally end. When news of the treaty reached Europe and the other parts of the Islamic world, reactions were mixed. Some praised both leaders for their wisdom in ending a destructive war. Others criticized them for failing to achieve the total victory that their followers had expected. But history would judge Richard and Saladin not by their military conquests, but by their ability to find honor and dignity even in the midst of bitter conflict. The Treaty of Jaffa represented something entirely new in the relationship between Christian and Muslim civilizations. For the first time, leaders from both sides had negotiated as equals, recognizing each other's legitimate interests and working together to find solutions that both could accept. It was a model of civilized behavior that would influence diplomatic practices for centuries to come. The autumn winds of 1192 carried the sound of trumpets across the harbor of Acre as Richard the Lionheart prepared to leave the Holy Land forever. His great crusade had not achieved the glorious victory he had dreamed of, but something far more valuable had emerged from the ashes of war. Two enemies had discovered that honor could exist even between the bitterest of foes, and that discovery would echo through the centuries long after both men had returned to dust. Richard's departure from the Holy Land in October 1192 marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in medieval history. As his ship disappeared over the horizon, Saladin reportedly stood on the walls of Jerusalem and spoke words that would be remembered for centuries. He said that he would rather have lost all his cities than see such a worthy opponent leave their shores. It was the ultimate tribute from one great warrior to another. The voyage home proved to be Richard's final great adventure. Traveling disguised through territories controlled by his enemies, the English king was captured in Austria and spent more than a year as a prisoner of the Holy Roman Emperor. When he finally returned to England in 1194, he found his kingdom in chaos and his brother John in open rebellion. Richard spent his remaining years fighting to restore his authority, but he never forgot the lessons he had learned in the Holy Land. Richard's death came in 1199 during a siege in France, struck down by a crossbow bolt fired from the walls of an insignificant castle. As he lay dying, witnesses said his thoughts turned to Saladin and the respect they had shared despite their different faiths. The Lionheart's last words were reportedly a prayer asking God to grant him the same mercy in death that Saladin had shown to defeated enemies during their war. Meanwhile, in Damascus, Saladin was facing his own struggles with the aftermath of the Third Crusade. The great coalition he had built to fight the Christians was already beginning to fracture as different Muslim rulers returned to their old habits of fighting each other. The Sultan spent his final years trying to hold together the unity he had created, knowing that without it, the Muslim world would once again become vulnerable to outside attack. Saladin's death in March 1193, just months after Richard's departure, shocked the entire Islamic world. The great Sultan died as he had lived, with dignity and concern for others. When his treasurers opened his strongboxes after his funeral, they found that the man who had controlled the wealth of Egypt and Syria had died almost penniless. He had given away his personal fortune to help the poor and to ransom Muslim prisoners held by the Crusaders. The immediate aftermath of both leaders' deaths seemed to confirm the fears of their supporters. Without Richard's strong leadership, the Crusader states gradually lost territory to Saladin's successors. Without Saladin's unifying presence, the Muslim world split apart into competing factions that spent more energy fighting each other than defending against Christian attacks. It appeared that both men's achievements would die with them. But history had other plans for Richard and Saladin. Instead of being forgotten as just another pair of medieval warlords, they became symbols of something much greater than military conquest. Their story began to grow in the telling, passed down through generations of chroniclers, poets, and storytellers who recognized that these two men had achieved something extraordinary. In the Christian world, Richard's reputation evolved in fascinating ways over the centuries. Medieval chroniclers celebrated him as the perfect example of knightly virtue, emphasizing his courage in battle and his devotion to the crusading ideal. Later generations focused more on his role as a symbol of English national pride, conveniently forgetting that he had spent almost no time in England and spoke French better than English. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Richard's legend was how it came to include his respect for Saladin. Instead of hiding this relationship, Christian storytellers celebrated it as proof that even the greatest Christian knight could recognize virtue in his enemies. Tales spread throughout Europe of the courteous exchanges between the two leaders, their mutual gifts, and their diplomatic correspondence. Saladin's reputation in the Islamic world followed a similar pattern of growth and transformation. Initially remembered as the liberator of Jerusalem and the unifier of the Muslim world, he gradually became a symbol of ideal Islamic leadership. His mercy toward defeated enemies, his personal piety, and his concern for justice made him a model that later Muslim rulers tried to emulate. What made Saladin's legend even more powerful was the fact that even his Christian enemies praised his character. European chroniclers who had every reason to portray him as a barbarian instead wrote admiringly of his honor, his generosity, and his faithful adherence to his promises. This cross-cultural respect was almost unknown in medieval literature and helped establish Saladin as a figure who transcended religious boundaries. The Renaissance period saw both figures incorporated into the growing literature of chivalric romance. Poets and playwrights across Europe created elaborate stories about their adventures, often emphasizing their mutual respect and the nobility they showed even in conflict. These fictional accounts sometimes strayed far from historical truth, but they helped spread the idea that true greatness was measured by how one treated one's enemies. During the Enlightenment, intellectuals began to use Richard and Saladin as examples in debates about religious tolerance and the possibility of peace between different civilizations. Voltaire and other philosophers argued that if a Christian king and a Muslim sultan could find common ground in the brutal 12th century, then surely more civilized ages could do even better. The 19th century brought new interest in both figures as European scholars began studying medieval Islamic sources and comparing them with Christian accounts. For the first time, historians could tell the story from both perspectives, revealing how remarkably similar the two men had been in their values and their approaches to leadership. In the modern era, both Richard and Saladin have become symbols of their respective civilizations at their best. Saladin appears on the currencies and national emblems of several Arab countries, while statues of Richard stand in cities across the English-speaking world. More importantly, their story continues to be told whenever people need. Examples of how enemies can maintain honor and dignity even in the midst of bitter conflict. The true measure of their legacy lies not in the territories they conquered or the battles they won, but in the model they created for civilized warfare and honorable leadership. In an age when religious differences led to terrible cruelties, they showed that faith could coexist with tolerance. In a time when war was often little more than organized brutality, they demonstrated that conflict could be conducted with dignity and respect. Modern military academies still study their campaigns as examples of strategic and tactical excellence. Diplomats point to the Treaty of Jaffa as an early example of successful conflict resolution between different cultures. Most importantly, their story continues to inspire people who believe that even in the darkest conflicts, human decency can survive and flourish. Perhaps the greatest tribute to both men is that their names are still spoken with respect by people of all faiths and cultures. More than 800 years after their deaths, Richard and Saladin remain proof that greatness is measured not just by what we achieve, but by how we achieve it. They showed the world that true honor lies not in defeating one's enemies, but in earning their respect.